My name is Badu. When I was able to rent a room in Accra, it felt like a dream come true. I grew up in a small village in Ghana, surrounded by the warmth of family, the simplicity of rural life, and the dreams of a brighter future. Like many young men, I wanted more than what my village could offer. The endless fields of cocoa and maize, the dusty roads and the quiet evenings were comforting, but I craved the excitement and opportunities of the city. So, after completing high school, I packed my few belongings and headed to Accra, the capital city. Accra was everything I had imagined and more. The towering buildings, the busy streets filled with cars and trotros, the markets bustling with activity. It was a world so different from my village, but the city was also unforgiving. Within days, I realized that living in Accra without money or connections was a battle. I had no relatives in the city, so I had to rely on friends from my village who had moved there earlier. They lived in a tiny room that was already overcrowded, but they welcomed me with open arms. Perching wasn't easy. Every night I spread a mat on the floor and tried to sleep, despite the heat and the mosquitoes buzzing around. In the mornings, I woke up early to clean the room, sweep the compound, and make sure everything was tidy before my friends left for work. For 5 long weeks, I walked the streets of Accra searching for a job. My shoes wore thin from all the walking, and my spirit grew heavy with rejection. We're not hiring. Come back next month. You're not qualified. These words echoed in my ears every evening as I returned to my friend's room, defeated and tired. Still, I refused to give up. My family was counting on me. Finally, after weeks of disappointment, my persistence paid off. I got a job at a meat factory on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the dream job I had hoped for, but it was something. The factory was owned by a wealthy woman named Mrs. Asare, and it was one of the largest in Accra. From the moment I started working there, it was clear that Mrs. Asare was no ordinary boss. She was strict, cold, and unapproachable. Her sharp eyes seemed to see everything, and her silence was more intimidating than any shout. If you arrived late, even by a minute, she would give you a glare that made your heart race. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence alone was enough to keep everyone in line. For me, arriving late became a regular occurrence. I hated it, but there was little I could do. As a percher, I had responsibilities at home. I couldn't leave for work without cleaning the room and making sure everything was in order for my friends. Every time I walked into the factory late, I braced myself for her icy stare. Working at the factory was exhausting. The hours were long and the tasks were repetitive. My hands ached from handling slabs of meat, and my back screamed in protest by the end of each day. The pay was barely enough to survive, but I reminded myself to be grateful. At least I had a job. Despite my gratitude, there were moments when bitterness crept in. I thought about my father, a hard-working farmer who had given everything to provide for us. Why did life reward people like Mrs. Asare, who treated others so poorly, while my father struggled just to put food on the table? One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, my phone buzzed with a WhatsApp message. I froze when I saw the sender, Mrs. Asare. Why was she messaging me? My hands shook as I opened the message. It was a simple greeting, but it filled me with dread. Out of fear and respect, I quickly typed a reply. "Good evening, madam." At least that's what I thought I had typed. In my haste, I didn't notice that autocorrect had changed my message to "Good evening, my love." Reply came almost immediately. "Thank you for accepting to be my love. I've been waiting for this day. I've been lonely ever since my husband left the country. Let's keep this secret so no one finds out." I stared at my phone in disbelief. Was this a joke? Before I could delete my message and correct the mistake, another message from her appeared. Tomorrow don't come to work. Rest well so you have energy for me in the evening. I'll rent a nice apartment for you in an expensive area. You shouldn't be scrubbing bathrooms as a percher. Thanks for loving me, my dear." That night I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions and fears. How could this be happening? What would people say if they found out? What if her husband returned? And yet, as I lay there, the temptation of her offer began to outweigh my fears. She was offering me a way out of my struggles, a chance to live in comfort and escape the hardships of my current life. By 4 a.m., after hours of tossing and turning, I made my decision. I would date her. It wasn't just about the money, it was about survival. The next morning, I went about my chores with a new sense of purpose. Later, I visited the herbs market to buy concoctions that would boost my energy. I didn't know what the evening would bring, but I wanted to be prepared. That evening, I told my friends I was traveling to the village and might not return. I took a motorcycle to her house, my heart pounding with every mile. The security man at the gate questioned me, but after confirming my identity with her, he let me in. The night that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. She was relentless, passionate, and full of energy. By morning, I was completely exhausted, but she seemed pleased. Before I left, she handed me a thick envelope of cash and told me to find a better place to live. With her support, I began searching for a new home. Eventually, I found a beautiful house in an expensive area. Strangely, the landlord was only asking for $20 a month, so I paid for 10 years up front. At first, life in the new house was peaceful, but one evening as I was cooking, something terrifying happened. The pepper I was chopping splashed into my eyes, causing a burning pain. I ran to the sink to wash my face, but when I turned on the tap, blood poured out instead of water. Panic gripped me. My vision blurred and I stumbled, hitting my head against the wall. Everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was lying in my bedroom. How had I gotten there? Who had brought me? As I lay there, trembling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house that had seemed like a blessing now felt like a curse. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange events in the kitchen. The memory of what happened kept playing in my head over and over like a bad dream I couldn't escape. I was terrified, confused, and full of questions. How did I go from the kitchen to my bedroom without knowing? What caused the tap to rush with blood instead of water? Was I losing my mind, or was something supernatural happening in the house? These thoughts clouded my mind, making it hard to focus on anything else. The next day, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed to share what happened with someone I trusted. At work, during our lunch break, I called my best friend, Obiri, aside. He was someone I could count on, and I hoped he would understand. "My man," I began, my voice shaky. "You know that house I just rented at Despite Hills?" "Of course I know it," he replied, giving me a concerned look. "Why are you trembling like this? Is everything all right?" "My brother," I said, lowering my voice so no one else could hear. "Something very strange happened to me yesterday in that house. I was in the kitchen cooking and pepper splashed into my eyes. The burning was so bad that I rushed to the sink to wash it off. But when I turned on the tap, blood came pouring out instead of water." "Blood?" Obiri exclaimed, his eyes wide with shock. "Yes, blood," I confirmed, nodding. I panicked and tried to find my way out of the kitchen, but I stumbled, hit my head, and blacked out. The next thing I knew, I woke up in my bedroom. I have no idea how I got there. Obiri said, scratching his head. "This is serious, my guy. Are you sure it wasn't just a bad dream?" "It wasn't a dream," I insisted. "Everything felt real. I don't know what's going on in that house, but I'm scared. I don't think I can spend another night there alone." "Don't worry," Obiri said, patting me on the shoulder. I'll come over to your place tonight. You won't have to stay there alone. Whatever is going on, we'll figure it out together." Hearing that made me feel a little better. At least I wouldn't have to face another night in the house by myself. After work, we headed to my place together. On the way, we stopped at a small market to buy some foodstuffs. I wanted to prepare a good meal since I had company. Cooking always helped me feel calm, and I hoped it would take my mind off the strange events in the house. When we got home, I went straight to the kitchen and began preparing yam with a rich stew. I used some of the meat that Mrs. Asare had given me. As the aroma of the food filled the house, I noticed Obiri watching me with a smile. "Badu, you're really a good cook," he said, laughing. "With skills like this, you don't even need a wife in the future." We both laughed, but his joke reminded me of Asantewaa, my girlfriend back in the village. She had always believed in me and supported my dreams. Before I left for the city, she had made me promise to stay faithful, work hard, and come back to marry her. As I thought about Asantewaa, guilt began to creep into my mind. I thought about my complicated relationship with Mrs. Asare. She had given me money and helped me live a more comfortable life, but it felt wrong. I didn't want to betray Asantewaa, and I didn't want to continue living under Mrs. Asare's control. I started thinking about how I could save the money she gave me, invest it in a business, and eventually become independent. I was so deep in thought that I didn't even realize the food was ready. It wasn't until Obiri tapped me on the shoulder that I snapped out of it. "Badu, the food is right in front of you," he said, smiling. "Are you going to eat, or are you just going to keep daydreaming?" We ate together, laughing and talking about random things. For a moment, everything felt normal. I almost forgot about the strange events in the house. After dinner, it was time to sleep. Since the house didn't have much furniture yet, we shared the same bed. It didn't take long for both of us to fall asleep. Around midnight, I woke up because I needed to use the bathroom. As I turned to check on Obiri, I realized he wasn't in bed. His side of the bed was empty, and the blanket was tossed aside. Confused, I sat up and looked around the room. "Where could he have gone?" I whispered to myself. My heart started to race as I listened for any sounds in the house. The silence was unsettling. Got out of bed and called out softly, "Obiri? Where are you?" There was no response. The air in the room felt heavy, and a strange sense of unease crept over me. I decided to check the living room, thinking he might have gone there for some reason. I tiptoed through the hallway, my footsteps barely making a sound. When I reached the living room, it was empty. The door was still locked, and there was no sign of him anywhere. I checked the kitchen next, but it was also empty. The longer I searched, the more anxious I became. Where could he have gone? I kept asking myself. The house was silent, yet it felt like I wasn't alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I was completely shocked when I woke up and realized that Obiri, who had gone to bed in the same room as me, was nowhere to be found. His side of the bed was empty. His belongings, clothes, slippers, and bag were also gone. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Panic set in as I began searching the house. I checked every room, looked under the bed, opened closets, and even checked the bathroom. For a whole hour, I combed through every corner of the house, but there was no trace of him. The house was eerily silent, and the more I searched, the more uneasy I felt. Maybe he stepped out and will be back soon, I muttered to myself, trying to calm my nerves. But deep down, I knew something was not right. I couldn't shake off the strange things that had been happening in this house since I moved in. Feeling exhausted, I decided to lie down and get some rest, hoping he would return by morning. But even as I lay in bed, my mind was racing. I kept thinking about the blood from the kitchen tap, my mysterious blackout, and now this. Obiri's sudden disappearance. What was going on in this house? Eventually, I managed to fall asleep. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was check for any sign of Obiri, but he was still gone. His belongings were still missing, and there was no note or message from him. I was more confused than ever. I quickly prepared a light breakfast, though I barely had the appetite to eat. My thoughts were consumed by worry and confusion. After forcing myself to eat, I decided to head to work. Maybe being at the office and staying busy would distract me from the strange happenings at home. On my way to work, something unexpected happened. The car Mrs. Asare had bought for me suddenly broke down in the middle of the road. One moment it was running smoothly, and the next, it simply stopped. Frustrated, I stepped out of the car to check what might be wrong. I opened the hood and inspected the engine, but I couldn't find anything unusual. Everything looked fine, so I got back into the car and tried starting it again. To my surprise, it roared to life as if nothing had happened. Is something trying to slow me down today? I wondered aloud. It felt like everything was working against me, making me late for work. As I drove off, I couldn't help but think about how strange my life had become since moving into that house. When I finally arrived at the office, I was still shaken by the morning's events. But what shocked me the most was seeing Obiri at his desk, working as if nothing had happened. I walked straight up to him, my face a mix of confusion and surprise. "Obiri," I said, my voice slightly raised. "Where did you go last night?" "I searched the whole house for you." "What are you talking about?" he replied, looking genuinely puzzled. "I didn't go anywhere. I was at my house last night after work." "Wait," I said, trying to process his words. "You mean you didn't come to my house yesterday?" "No, I didn't," he said firmly. "Why would you think I did?" I stared at him, my heart pounding. But we went home together after work. We stopped to buy foodstuffs and I cooked. You even ate the food with me, and we slept in the same bed." Now it was his turn to look confused. "Badu, I think you're mistaken. I didn't go to your house. I went straight home after work." His words hit me like a brick. If he hadn't been at my house, then who was the person I spent the evening with? Who had eaten my food, laughed with me, and slept in my bed? I felt dizzy, and I had to grab the edge of his desk to steady myself. My mind was racing with questions, but none of them had answers. Was I losing my grip on reality? Was the house playing tricks on me, or was there something more sinister at play? I couldn't stay at work. I told my supervisor I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. As I drove back to the house, my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I knew I needed answers, but I was also terrified of what I might find. When I got home, the house was just as I had left it, silent and empty. I walked into the living room, feeling a chill run down my spine. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I sat down on the couch, my mind filled with fear and confusion. What was happening to me? Was the house haunted? Was I imagining things? And most importantly, who or what was in my house last night pretending to be Obiri? As the evening crept in, the house seemed to grow colder and darker, even with the lights on. I decided to leave the television on to drown out the eerie silence, but it didn't help much. Every creak, every shadow seemed magnified, and my paranoia only grew. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, determined not to let anything strange happen again. I even blocked the bedroom door with a chair and kept my phone close, ready to call for help if needed. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but feel that my nightmare was far from over. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it was restless and filled with disturbing dreams. In one dream, I saw myself walking through the house, only to find another version of me sitting in the living room, staring back with hollow eyes. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. Morning finally came, but it brought little relief. I knew I couldn't continue living like this, but I didn't know what to do. Should I move out of the house? Should I seek help from a spiritual leader or even the police? All I knew was that something was very wrong, and I needed to find out what. The house was no longer a place of comfort. It had become a prison of fear and mystery. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind full of questions, I prepared myself for whatever lay ahead. I went straight to Obiri's house. He told me he knows a powerful spiritual man called Anokie, so we headed towards his house. When we reached there, the man did not ask me anything. All he said was that the house I occupy is not safe, so I should give him $500 to buy some items to banish the spirit from the house. Immediately, the man said that the problem of the tormenting spirit in my house was not the main problem again. The main headache I got instantly was where to raise $500 to be free. I thought and thought. Finally, I hatched a plan. I went to tell Mrs. Asare that my mom in the village has a serious problem and needs surgery that will cost $1,000. She immediately went into her bedroom and handed a fat envelope to me. It was full of $100 bills. I immediately went to see Obiri and he asked if I have gotten the money. I said yes. He tried to be inquisitive to know the source, but I intelligently let that slide off. When we went to the man, he said we should give him the money and return the following day because he needs to buy some items to do the rituals in my house. That evening, I went to sleep at Obiri's house. The following we went to pick Mr. Anokie and headed to my house. When he came, he requested for pig's milk as part of the items he needs to banish the spirit tormenting me. I immediately set the vehicle on the road and headed to the principal streets of Accra. I drove through all the places I knew, but couldn't get some. Luckily, I met a classmate who directed me to a piggery near a cemetery where I got some of the pig's milk. I hurriedly drove home. After several incantations and rituals, Mr. Anokie assured me that the spirit has been laid to rest, so I should stay there in peace till forever, as the landlord has even left the country for good. I stayed in the house for 2 years with no sign of any spirit or whatsoever. I now became a happy man again. All too sooner than I expected, Mr. Asare returned from America. Mrs. Asare told me that people have started suspecting us, so I should take some cash to start my own business and never to step feet at her workplace again before her husband also starts suspecting anything between us. I started my business with a lot of hope and determination. Things were going well, and I could see the fruits of my hard work paying off. I had a stable income, and for the first time I felt that I was in control of my future. Everything seemed to be falling into place. However, as I thought about how things were going, one thing kept lingering in my mind. The promise I had made to Asantewaa, my girlfriend. I had told her that one day I would marry her. It was something I had told her when we were still dating in the village, and now it was time to keep that promise. So, I decided to make it official. I went back to the village, got engaged to Asantewaa, and we began preparing for our future together. It was a joyous occasion, and we couldn't be happier. Asantewaa was the love of my life, and we were ready to take the next step. We were now engaged, and it felt like everything was perfect. We moved in together into our own little apartment. This was the first time either of us had lived in a place together, and it was a big step for us. We were both excited and nervous at the same time, but the excitement far outweighed the nerves. It was a new chapter in our lives, and we were ready to embrace it. At first, everything felt perfect. We cooked together, ate together, and even went for evening walks after dinner. We spent every moment together, sharing our hopes, dreams, and plans for the future. It was easy to see that we were in love, and I thought that Asantewaa and I were completely in sync. She was the one I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, and I was sure she felt the same way. But after some time, things started to feel a little off. It wasn't anything big at first, just little things that I couldn't quite explain. Asantewaa began acting a bit strangely, and it made me uneasy. She became so attached to me that it almost felt like she couldn't stand being away from me for even a minute. I thought it was just her way of showing affection, but then she started saying things that I couldn't understand. One evening, after we had finished dinner, Asantewaa said something to me that made me pause. "Darling," she said, "when you're not at home, I still feel like you're here with me." At first, I thought she was just being sweet, but then, a few days later, she said something else that made me wonder. "Whenever you're at work," she told me, "I often hear your voice calling my name, like you're right here in the room with me." Now, this started to worry me. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was getting strange. I tried to brush it off at first, but the more she said it, the more I started to feel like something wasn't right. Then, it happened again. One day when I came home from work, I found Asantewaa sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. She had this glazed look in her eyes, and she didn't seem to notice I was there. I sat down next to her and asked what was wrong. She looked at me with a distant look on her face and said, "I think there's something wrong with me." "Why do you think that?" I asked, now genuinely concerned. "I saw you today," she said quietly. "You were walking from the kitchen to the bedroom, and then you stood by the window looking out." "But I was at work all day," I replied, confused. "How could you have seen me?" She sighed deeply and said, "I know you were at work, but I saw you." That's when I started to feel the weight of worry pressing down on me. I thought maybe she was imagining things or that she was just exhausted. But the more she said it, the more I began to feel like something was wrong, like something was happening that I couldn't explain. For the next few days, she continued telling me that she saw me in the apartment when I was away at work. She could describe exactly what I was wearing, where I was standing, and even the way I was acting. But I wasn't there. I was at work. I was becoming more and more concerned. My girlfriend, the person I loved and trusted, was acting in ways that didn't make sense. She was withdrawing from me, becoming quieter, and it seemed like she was scared. Sometimes I would find her sitting in the corner of the room, just staring at me with a blank expression, as if she wasn't really there. It was as though she wasn't fully present with me anymore. Then, one night, things took an even stranger turn. Asantewaa was very tired and decided to go to bed early. I sat by her on the edge of the bed as she was falling asleep. I held her hand and gently reassured her that everything would be fine. But just before she drifted off to sleep, she said something that sent chills down my spine. "You're not here," she whispered. "Honey, I'm right here," I said, trying to calm her down. "Don't worry, everything's fine." "No," she said again, "you're not here. You're in the kitchen." I froze, not knowing how to respond. I didn't know what she meant, but before I could say anything else, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It was a strange sound, like a chair scraping across the floor. Then I heard footsteps walking down the hallway. Fear gripped me and I felt my heart race. What was happening? Was she dreaming? Or was something else going on? Suddenly, the bedroom door handle began to turn. I was paralyzed with fear. The door creaked open slowly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was me. Standing there in the doorway was a man who looked exactly like me. It was as if I was staring at myself in the mirror. but the person in the doorway had cold, lifeless eyes. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. The other version of me just stood there for a moment, looking at me with a strange, vacant expression. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, closing the door behind him. I was frozen in place, unable to process what had just happened. I jumped out of bed, ran to the door, and opened it. The hallway was empty. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, but the other me was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished. My mind was racing. Was I dreaming? Had I just imagined it? It didn't feel like a dream. It felt too real. As I stood there in the hallway trying to calm myself down and make sense of what had just happened, I heard a faint voice coming from the kitchen. It wasn't my voice. It was Asantewaa's voice. "We are here to stay," she said softly. "Forever." I ran into the bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. Asantewaa was lying there, just as I had left her, sound asleep. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. What was going on? I grabbed her, pulled her out of bed, and without thinking, ran out of the apartment. We left the apartment in a panic and went straight to my pastor's house, not knowing what else to do. The next day, I returned to the apartment to gather our things. I couldn't stay there anymore. The place felt wrong, like it was filled with something I couldn't explain. We moved in with my pastor for a while, and eventually we found a new place to live. The police investigated the situation and found out that the man who rented the house to me had a dark past. He was arrested for his involvement in illegal activities, and the house was eventually destroyed. The authorities said it was cursed, and they burned it down to remove whatever evil spirits were attached to it. Years later, Asantewaa and I got married. We were blessed with 3 beautiful children, and our lives felt full of joy and love. Looking back, I think about everything that happened in that apartment. It was a terrifying experience, but it taught me an important lesson. Before you move into any house, always pray for protection. Have your spiritual leader, whether that's a pastor, imam, or anyone else, bless the house and remove any evil spirits. It's also important to investigate the history of the house before you move in. God is always with us, watching over us, even in the darkest moments. Keep believing and praying, because He is not asleep. He will guide and protect us, no matter what we face.